attendance. I'm the Associate Professor of Economics and also Director of the Center for the Study of Occupational Regulation. Not that long ago, the U.S. corporate tax rate received heavy media coverage. Reducing corporate tax rate was one of the signature pieces of both the John McCain and Mitt Romney presidential campaign. The U.S. statutory rate of 39.1% is the third highest in the world, after only Chad and the United Arab Emirates. We've all heard about the recent EU ruling that Apple received a preferential tax rate of 0.005% while they were doing business in Ireland. Some U.S. companies have also merged with companies overseas to receive more favorable corporate tax rates. Seeking lower corporate tax rates, Burger King, a company that I'm sure all of you are familiar with, merged with Canadian-based Tim Hortons 2 years ago. This April, the U.S. Treasury announced new policy to reduce this practice. This practice that we're referring to often gets referred to as tax inversion. This is exactly what Dan's going to spend some time speaking about this afternoon. We're very pleased to welcome Professor Dan Shaviro, Wayne Perry Professor of Taxation at New York University School of Law, to speak more with us about tax inversions. Dan is one of the world's leading experts on international and corporate taxation. He has published almost a dozen books, including Fixing U.S. International Taxation and Decoding the U.S. Corporate Tax. Dan is regularly contacted by the popular press. In fact, just this morning in the side office, he was contacted by Bloomberg to speak on the Apple EU case. He just last week was interviewed by CNBC's Squawk Box to speak on the EU ruling on Apple. So please give Professor Dan Shaviro a warm St. Francis welcome.
Well, thanks. So it's interesting to be working in this. I do some of my writing in this field, which seems sort of arcane, and then it's on the front page of the newspapers a lot. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things on the front page of the newspapers. But before that, I think it needs to be put in context. I think one reason the politics in our country is in such a bad state, there are many reasons, but one of them is that to really understand an issue at all, to really know what's going on, you have to know a lot about it. So now there are way more issues out there than I know a lot about, but there are a couple I know about, so I thought it'd be fun to put that in context. But before I even get to that, I want to put something else in context, which I do see there are a few students in here, and I just wanted to put in a kind of plug for you guys. I'm not saying you should go to law school. Actually, I think law school used to be over-popular among students in terms of its real prospects. I think it's flipped to becoming under-popular. I think for it really to be a good thing to do, first of all, it has to be a life and set of interests you think would work for you. Also, it probably does these days work better if you go to if you're able to get into a good law school, because that helps the employment prospects. But one further thing I'll say about that is, if you find yourself going to law school and you're thinking of doing tax law, you might think if you're at some student cocktail party at the law school, the only ones in tax will be the ones in the corner no one's speaking to. In fact, actually, it's better than that. There are actually job surveys that show that among junior lawyers, tax lawyers have the highest job satisfaction. Well, I say the highest. I don't know, there might be some other fields, but higher, for example, than litigators, corporate lawyers, the bigger things that I could explain why that's true. It's actually for very good reasons. So keep that in mind if any of this interests you at all. Okay, so to understand this stuff about like what could be happening with Apple and the EU and the state aid cases and the inversions and all that, you kind of really have to go way back and start at the beginning and sort of ask what these come out of the corporate tax on the income tax in corporations, and that sort of comes out of the corporate tax on individuals. So I think the starting point really has to be, what do we have? Why do we have an income tax on individuals, and what are some of its most basic features? So obviously, under an income tax, the more income you earn, the more you pay, and it has the effect of discouraging earning income, but that's not the intention. It's not clear why we want to discourage earning income. So the reason you would have such a tax is for distributional reasons. It's sometimes given the term ability to pay. So we would say we think Bill Gates can afford to pay more tax. Obviously what we mean by this, can afford to, or has more ability to, or it'll crimp his lifestyle. Yes, Bill Gates, there's a notion that Bill Gates should pay more tax than anyone in this room. That people in this room, the students will project forward into in your careers. You're doing pretty well. You should probably pay more tax than someone who's homeless. So it's about ability to pay, how well off you are. So income is a measure, and there are other measures as well of how well off you are materially that determines how much you pay. And by the way, when people talk about, say, a flat tax, that's still an ability to pay taxes. After all, under a flat tax, if you have more income or more whatever the tax base is, you still pay more. If you don't like ability to pay at all, what you probably might be interested in is a lump sum tax, a uniform head tax, which everyone pays the same amount. So if you think that is fair, I welcome you to campaign for it, but I don't think you'll get any votes. If you don't think that's fair, you're probably in an ability to pay world. Anyway, so if we're looking at people's ability to pay, and say we're taking income as the measure of that, you kind of have to look at the person's worldwide income. So how rich is Bill Gates compared to you? You kind of can't say, oh, we're not going to count the money Bill earned abroad. Obviously, he's well off from money he's earned or from his wealth or anything else, whether it's in the U.S. or outside. So you have to get into looking at at income in the whole world. That'll get you into some questions such as what if Bill Gates earns money in Singapore, Ireland, England, Germany, or France? What happens if they tax the same income? So that's part of what the field of international tax is about. You'll have to face those questions, but it's sort of obvious you're going to have to look at his foreign source income, to use the term, because it's part of how well off he is. And I just want to say one other basic thing about the individual income tax is we have something called the realization requirement, which, insofar as you've ever thought about income, which may be not a lot, it would seem intuitively obvious to you, but it's more problematic than they seem. So suppose you buy 100 shares of Microsoft stock at a point when Microsoft isn't doing so well, or maybe when it's a startup, if you're a little older than the students certainly in the room. Then Microsoft goes up to a huge value. You are economically richer. The value of what you own is higher. People who think about what the term income means in an economic sense would say you have earned economic income, but it's not taxed until you sell it. You could well imagine if we were going to tax you anytime the property, your home, or your stock portfolio or anything else goes up in value, we're going to tax you right away just because the value changed. You can probably see right away that if it happened to you, you'd probably resent it. There'd be a bunch of objections raised to it. But once we have that rule, it's called the realization rule, you're only taxed on the gain or loss in property when you realize it, which is a lawyer's way of saying, for the most part, you sell it, or if it's stock, you get dividends from it or something like that. That turns out to have amazingly calamitous effects on the income tax system. It sort of means that unless you have some very complicated rules to address tax planning, very rich people should be able to avoid ever paying any tax, at least if they're making money through property, not through salary. So it's a rule that has major effects. It basically means all you have to do is earn income that's not realized, and against it deduct expenses that are deducted, and you can see you go to zero just like that. Or you find ways to economically sell an asset that aren't treated as a sale. So whatever one thinks of the realization requirement is a fundamental feature that has major effects. Anyway, so that's all about individuals. Then we get to corporations. So we have a corporate income tax. It's popular to say, I think Mitt Romney was one of the people who said it, he got laughed at sort of the way he said it. Corporations don't pay taxes, people do. Well, corporations do pay taxes in the sense that a company might write a check, but obviously a corporation can't bear the tax, meaning being the party that is less well off. To bear a tax, to be the one who is made poorer by it, in a sense that's meaningful, you have to be flesh and blood. Maybe there will be computers someday that can have feelings. But to bear the tax means you have less wealth and there's less stuff you can do with it. A corporation is just one lawyer phrase, or economics of law phrase, is the web of contracts. So when you're taxing the corporation, you're really taxing people in some way. Then one of the questions is, are you really taxing the shareholders, or does the tax get shifted to someone else? But leaving all that aside, so there's no reason to tax a corporation for its own sake. The reason to have an income tax in a corporation is an indirect way of taxing individuals. But once you have an individual tax on individuals, you kind of have to have a corporate income tax, and the reason is otherwise it kind of becomes a giant tax shelter, where as long as you earn money through a corporation, you're never taxed until you take the money out. Maybe you never have to take the money out. So once you have an income tax on individuals, and once we agree that you're gaining wealth because the corporation went up in value has not been realized, And once we also see that for a complex modern corporation, it's kind of hard to figure out who owns what piece of it. For all those reasons, you have to have a corporate income tax and on top of the individual income tax. It's kind of a backup for the individual income tax. You can't, if you're trying to tax people on their own income, you kind of have to tax them on their corporate income, and it's kind of agreed. You sort of have to do that at the entity level by taxing the corporation. But once you do that, you're into a whole new world of hurt. There are all kinds of problems that arise. And let me now bring up sort of cross-border. So you have two countries. Like say you just have the US and you have the UK. And if people just stayed in their own countries and earned in their own countries, the US would have its income tax and the UK would have its income tax. But once you have cross-border investments, US people are going to invest and earn money there, and UK are going to earn money there. You're going to have problems of overlap and how to resolve them. So both countries tax on both a residence basis or a source basis, and a source basis. Residence basis means you're an American, we're taxing you. We don't care where you live, where you earned it. You're an American, we're taxing you. And the US will also say, you earned income in our country, and therefore we're going to tax you, even though if you're not American. So we're going to tax income on a residence basis, it was earned by Americans, and we're going to tax income on a source basis, it was earned in the United States. So you can see you get into problems that the UK and the US are taxing the same income. As it happens, they have ways of resolving this so that it doesn't become too painful. But one thing you sort of know with individuals pretty well, you sort of know who's an American and who's English. It's true there are some people who move around, change their location or where they live. By the way, Boris Johnson, the Foreign Secretary of the UK, is an American citizen, although he hasn't been an American resident since he was a little child. So he actually, if only he had become Prime Minister of England, he could have reversed the American Revolution. All you do is run for president, which is constitutionally eligible. He could have reunited the two countries. But anyway, but for individuals, it's not that hard. Also, where are people earning income is usually not that hard. I live in New York. I work there. New York taxes my income. Suppose that Pennsylvania was a state separate country from, actually there is an income tax issue. You could imagine a problem of, if I get paid for giving this talk, of New York versus Pennsylvania for the state tax, but problems are pretty small. We sort of know I've giving this talk here. For people, it's often not hard to say what the residence is, not hard to say what the source is. Now we get to corporations. Well, first, what's the residence of a corporation? Where does it, quote, live? That's fundamentally a question that has no good answer, because the corporation is inanimate. So where a corporation lives, again, we're going to tax their own people. I'll just mention one more term I like. I call it the Monty Python tax principle, because it's from a Monty Python episode when the man in the bowler hat says, I think we should tax foreigners living abroad. It's a pretty good idea, but you can't really do it. So you can only tax, that's why you can only tax in residence and source. If they're one of your people, you can tax them. If you earned it in their place, you can tax them. But you can't tax foreigners living abroad. It'd be kind of appealing, because then they would pay for everything that we get. I imagine there wouldn't be much talk about cutting taxes in the U.S. if all we did was tax foreigners living abroad. Anyway, raise the taxes. But so the question is, who is a resident becomes very difficult. It's kind of hard to have a good answer for a corporation. So when you have, we say GE or McDonald's or Burger King until recently, or Apple as a U.S. company, that's an artifact of how the U.S. law defines a resident company. So the U.S., the rule is where you were incorporated. So if two Saudi guys decide to open a hummus shop in Germany, but they're dumb enough to incorporate in Delaware, that's a U.S. company. On the other hand, if someone in this room decides to have a startup or starts to have a pizzeria, well, in truth, you probably wouldn't incorporate it. But if you decide to have a pizza place in the corner, make a little extra money, and you incorporate in Ireland, the company is not a U.S. company. It'll probably still have U.S. source income from selling pizzas to people in this town, but it won't be a U.S. company. So the U.S. defines residence based purely on where you incorporate. One other point I'll just mention, I was getting ahead a little bit. Any company that does business in the US is probably, any major company is probably going to have a US corporation that does the business. Reason being that since the US taxes you on a source basis anyway, any income you're thought to have earned in the US, for that reason, you might as well give it to a separate company and kind of keep the rest of your corporate stuff out of the US. So you can tell the US, hands off, you have nothing to do with the rest of us. So what do they mean when they say, when Professor Timmons referred to Burger King inverted? What happened was this: there's Burger King, and that's a US company, and there's, what is it, Tim Hortons? There's Tim Hortons, that's a Canadian company, and they merged, and they decided to treat it as Tim Hortons buying Burger King. They could have just as well treated it as Burger King buying Tim Hortons. I think Burger King probably is a bit bigger. There's an expression that tax practitioners use: a minnow can swallow a whale, meaning a tiny company. If a tiny company merges with a giant company, they can say the tiny company is the owner. It kind of makes no difference. So anyway, what they did was they made the company on top, so Burger King, quote, inverted. There's still a US Burger King that sells hamburgers to people here, but they're a subsidiary of a foreign company now, and I've been talking a bit about why that matters. Anyway, so you have a fundamental question: what is a resident? Well, the US says if you incorporate it here, the UK and most of the world says you are a UK company if you're managed here, if you have headquarters here. That's the way most countries do it. And so, by the way, one fun thing, this is just to show you what international tax planning is like. So the US has an incorporation rule for deciding what is a US company. The UK has a management rule. Where are the managers? Where's the main headquarters? You can readily tell that because those are two different standards, it would be the easiest thing in the world for a company that's flexible to be a resident of both or a resident of neither. So both have happened. And again, just to give you a feel for how crazy and artificial corporate tax planning is, reflecting the artificiality of the basic concepts, this isn't that the Congress passed like sleazy giveaway rules. It's just, it's structural. At one point, companies thought, we'd like to be both, because why? It turned out if you kind of figure out a way to have tax losses, you have a company group and one of the company members loses money. It doesn't mean it's really losing money. It means it's borrowing a lot of debt on behalf of the whole group, or it might mean that they're overpaying fellow group members for things. Like, by the way, Starbucks in the UK is just like Starbucks here. You can barely go a block without stumbling into another Starbucks. So Starbucks is opening another store in the UK every 5 minutes. Starbucks UK was suffering giant tax losses and paying no tax, or at least zero, paying no UK tax. Why? Because Starbucks UK was ripped off by Starbucks Ireland, which overcharged it for things. Of course, when I say ripped off, my point is they don't care. The same people own both companies. So anyway, so one trick was to have your company be a resident of both countries. Then you can use losses in both countries against income of other group members. Apple freshened up the trick. They have it. Actually, I don't think they invented it. Professor Timmons referred to Apple's tax rate in Europe, and I think it's 0.005 or something like that. That's their tax rate on their profits in Europe. What did they do? Well, part of what they did, I don't want to try to explain the whole thing today, they came up with a company that wasn't resident anywhere. They incorporated in Ireland, I'll say Ireland instead of the UK, and they managed them out of the US. So this company resides nowhere. As a result, there was no country in the world that was going to tax it on a residence basis. It could only be taxed on a source basis, and that'll get to the other problem. So anyway, so you have, for corporations, so we have this fundamental idea that works well for individuals. We're going to tax any income of an American and any income that was earned in the United States. That sort of works pretty well with individuals. Again, there is the problem of overlap, but there are ways that that's addressed. And for individuals, I think it really works pretty well. No one's too upset about it. But for companies, I've just made the point that the residence of a company is completely artificial. It's very manipulable. It kind of doesn't really mean anything. So when we say a U.S. person is investing in the U.K., what does that mean when you're basing a U.S. person on whether you were incorporated in the U.S.? Again, Americans can incorporate anywhere they like, and foreigners can incorporate or not here or wherever they like, and even countries' headquarters rules. Headquarters is manipulable depending on how tough the country is. And to give an example, I once went to Luxembourg. where they weren't happy to hear me say that there should be more focus in international tax planning because Luxembourg makes a lot of money off the business. So you fly into Luxembourg City, and like right within one block of the airport are 20 high-rise hotels. Why? What's the appeal? Well, the appeal is this. There are a lot of countries that will say you're headquartered where your annual board meetings are. So people flying to Luxembourg City, it's a pretty nice city, by the way. It's very scenic. It's on a mountain, but they don't really want to have to like do anything. So the hotel where you have the meeting is right by the airport. So you go to the airport, you don't even take a cab. You walk to the hotel, and bingo, you're a Luxembourg headquartered company. So you can see that the notion of residence doesn't work well at all for corporations. The only reason it works as well as it does even is, why did Apple incorporate in the US? They now wish they hadn't. But Apple, I don't know, was it Steve Jobs, like in the garage? At that point, he didn't have, first of all, he didn't know how successful he'd be. He didn't have advisors talking to him, didn't have tax planners. For that matter, it might have been difficult for him in the first couple of years. What if he had incorporated in the Cayman Islands, as he probably should have? He has no money at that point. He's going to have to, and by the way, communications weren't so good in the 70s either. He's going to have to hire a lawyer in the Cayman Islands and have the documents go back and forth by, this being the 70s, by, I don't know, I guess they had FedEx. So you can see that in those days, so he incorporated in the US. So anyway, so you have a residence idea and it doesn't work well. It's kind of easy to have, for taxpayers to fund with that. Then you have source. You have to decide the source of income. Well, again, for you and me, we're physical people who are in a particular place at any time. And often if we're doing work, you kind of know where we are. So the source of income for individuals is not that complicated. But if you have an organization like Apple that's creating intangible property of enormous value, the question of where that income is created becomes very difficult. So let me give an example. How did Apple create the iPhone? Well, I think what they mainly did was they had a whole bunch of people who were engineers and such who were living in, in the Washington State area or the Bay Area or whatever. They had a whole lot of smart engineers working on it. They underpaid these people, and in quotes, they didn't really underpay them because if they did, the people would have left. But they paid them too little salary because they gave them stock options. So the company, quote, underpays these engineers, but if the product's successful, then their Apple stock goes up. So that's how they paid them. So in a formal sense, Apple underpaid the employees as employees, but the employees had an ownership interest. That's why they're willing to do it. So Apple's making these gigantic profits. So you'd think, well, these engineers, they were working in the West Coast of the United States. Surely that's American source income, and that's what the Treasury is saying, the US Treasury is saying that now to tell the Europeans, keep your mitts off the money, off the profits. But in the actual US tax rules, including deals that Apple was able to cut with the Treasury, which I think cut these deals not out of any corrupt reason, but because the law was so weak they kind of had no choice. In fact, Apple's profits fictionally appear to have been created somewhere else. So let me give an example of what Apple did, why Apple got that 0.05 tax rate. So suppose you had a great idea for a product. You had a great idea to make a new product, but you're really good at A, B, and C, but you're terrible at X, Y, and Z, and you know someone else who's really good at that. Maybe that person's a good marketer. Maybe, well, if you've seen Silicon Valley, like these different engineers, they're good at different things. So you make a deal with someone else. You say, kind of, I'll do this, you'll do that, and these are arm's length. These are people who aren't related to each other economically or any other way. And we'll find a way to share the profits, and the way they do it is sometimes cost sharing. Like, well, if I pay 60% of the costs, I get 60% of the profits. So these are deals people really make with each other. So Apple did a fake deal with itself. When I say fake, I'm not implying that it's fraudulent. It was simply tax planning that relies on things, that works under the US law, relies on things that are absurdly trivial. So Apple finds a partner. In the real world, Apple would never, ever, well, Apple hasn't happened to need real partners who would really have to cut into the action. You know Apple's not going to truly give away the iPhone profits. If they needed to partner with another company, maybe they'd think about it, but they're going to do it themselves. But here's what Apple did. They gave a lot of money to their affiliate in Ireland. Then they pretended that the affiliate in Ireland is like an arm's length party, is unrelated to them. Again, when I say pretended, I'm not saying they committed fraud. They're using a fiction that the law allows them to use. And so they say to their sub in Ireland, we have this tough project. Why don't we both pay some? We're going to make this thing called this iPhone. Maybe it's successful. Who knows? Make a lot of money. So why don't we split the profit and why don't we split the risk? And to do that, we'll split the cost. By the way, you can't split risk with yourself. So a parent company cannot actually split risk with its affiliate abroad. But they decide to split the expense, except the way they split the expense is kind of idiotic. The way they split the expense is that the affiliate in Ireland paid for a portion of the cost of developing the thing, and in return they got at least the EU rights. So anytime an iPhone is sold in the EU, Apple Ireland makes the profits, not Apple US. They probably gave them other international rights also, but I forget. So that sounds nice. Apple Ireland splitting the costs. How did they split the costs? The way they did is that the parent figured out how much money they needed. They paid them the money, and then the Apple Ireland paid it right back again. So they paid. Apple Ireland acquired this enormously valuable asset, which people would have paid billions for in reality. They got for nothing. Apple Ireland got the right to all the profits from selling iPhones abroad, at least in the EU and maybe more broadly. They paid for it by using money Apple had given them 5 seconds earlier. Again, this is not fraud, it's a fiction. Apple's tax advisors, we could have a talk about ethics of tax or ethics of corporations, and that would bring us in a different direction. But in terms of complying with of doing what the law allows, I wouldn't call it complying with the law. The law is not making them do this. They could make all the profits in the US, but on the other hand, they're doing something that works, and if you're Apple's tax director or chief financial officer, you're probably being derelict in your duty towards your shareholders if you don't do this. So there's a ridiculous circle of cash, and the result is that Ireland, the Apple Ireland firm, owns all of the rights to sell iPhones out of the US. Why didn't they get piggy and go for the US part too? Well, because that would have been treated as US source income because of the sales in the US, so it wouldn't have helped. So even if Apple Ireland owned the US rights also, it still would have been taxed in the US, so they didn't bother with that. So what's happened is you can see how the source of income has been manipulated. And again, it's completely legal. Is it from Apple's political power in Congress? Well, yes, to a degree, but it's also just from the difficulties of dealing with the artificiality of these concepts. By the way, if the US gets super tough on Apple and says, we're going to tax you much more, Apple might say, guess what, we might leave the United States. And what that means, whether it just means being owned by another company or whether it means their engineers move, or debate what that means. So you have the source of income being completely artificial. So you don't know what the residence of corporate income is hard to tax, it's hard to determine and very manipulable. The source of the income also. This money quote ends up in Ireland. By the way, it doesn't stay in Ireland. And again, when I say stay in Ireland, it's how did this Irish company, this Irish company which has maybe a few thousand employees, is taking a huge share of Apple's worldwide profit. So why did Apple do this? Well, the U.S. tax rate is corporate tax rate. You said 39.1. You were counting the state and local tax. That's actually the right thing to do. But just to make it simple, I'll say 35. That's just the federal rate. It's true that the state and local counts also. Ireland is 12.5%. So you'd kind of much rather be taxed at 12.5% than at 35. But why stop there? 12.5. That's still too high. I mean, it's higher than zero. So they made a deal with Ireland, and this is before they came in. What they said to Ireland was, we'd be happy to employ a few thousand Irish people doing nothing in particular for Apple. We'll give you 5,000 jobs, and they won't be, I don't think they're great jobs, but they're not horrible ones, and the Irish aren't complaining. If you'd rather we not, we'll go someplace else. So Ireland heard that and thought, that sounds like a good deal to us. I don't think there's been any criticism of Ireland correctly pursuing its self-interest. This often happens. Companies come in, like in the US building stadiums. Company says, or a sports team says, well, you have to give us a stadium. I think a lot of economists study this, say these things often don't, they're too expensive, they're not really paid. But I don't think Ireland lost in this. They're basically getting getting some jobs, 5,000 jobs, better than nothing, and Apple can go where it likes for this. But then there's going to be billions of profits reported in Ireland, even though it's completely fictional. It's because the Ireland company, pretend for this stupid reason I outlined, reports to own the full value of the iPhone technology when sold abroad. That's too high, so they negotiated this up front with the Irish. So here's what they said, what the Irish agreed. They said, we're going to have, I think this company really is located in Ireland, it really is managed in Ireland, which just means there are a few people headquarters. We're going to have another Irish company also. Well, I'm sorry, Irish company is the wrong word. We're going to have a second company. Ireland is in this company's name. But this company is going to be incorporated in Ireland, and it's going to be managed in the US. It might be, but it actually has no employees. This company has 0 employees. I think it has a mailbox. I don't know that it has a phone, but it does have a postal box. And they kind of agree with the Irish government. These guys are sort of the, even though there's no one there, they are, these are really the people who are, actually, they're going to have, if I remember this correctly, they're going to have a branch in the Cayman Islands. They're going to have their, I think their mailbox in the Cayman Islands because they have no employees. These are the sales geniuses. They're responsible for our profits. So they basically agree with the Irish government. How about if we do this arrangement? If you agree, if you agree that 99.5% of, or maybe it was higher than that, of the profits of Ireland as a whole are actually earned by these guys. And so now, I'm sorry, this company is in fact the fake Irish company, the one that resides nowhere. It's managed in the US and it's incorporated in Ireland. So the Irish say, it's not managed here, it's not an Irish company. The US says it's not incorporated here, it's not a US company. Anyway, so the Irish are taxing this company on its Irish source income. That's all they're taxing it on. And they agree that this is not Irish source income because this fictional company is in the Cayman Islands. And it's earning 99.5% of the joint profits of the overall Irish profits. So all the money at first goes to Ireland at 12.5%, but then the Irish have agreed in advance, we're going to agree that 99.5% of it isn't actually earned in Ireland, it's earned someplace else. The Caymans isn't going to tax it because they're a true tax haven, they're a country that has no income tax. By the way, people gripe about tax havens. Tax havens have to be well-managed countries. Haiti is not well suited to be a tax haven because no one, or North Korea because no one would trust the money there. Caymans has the rule of law. It's a well-governed country. It's a small country. They have beaches and so forth. And you actually trust them that they're going to. So the Cayman Islands is just a smart business, being smart for business. They're agreeing to host these things. They're getting no income tax revenue, but their lawyers get a few dollars. They get trivial fees, but it adds up. The amount of money the Cayman Islands gets from their business, it's exceptionally low on a per transaction basis, but it kind of adds up. So you have income that's being taxed on a source basis nowhere. Again, this is what I'm talking about is basically all of the money that Apple earned via it's selling the iPhone abroad. It's basically not taxed. There is some tax on the Apple selling iPhones in the US, and believe me, they have a little fun with that, but they can't completely avoid that tax. But all the profits from selling iPhones abroad, first the Irish company, quote, owns it, so it's entitled to all the profits at the expense of the Apple parent, which would have been outrageously scammed in a business deal if not for the fact that they're doing it themselves, so of course they don't care. And then it's further shifted out to there. So you have, we're taxing corporations as a way of taxing individuals, and we're taxing you on a residence basis or on a source basis, and neither one is working. Well, Apple is still a US company. But this income is kind of given away to an affiliate, and then it ends up being taxed nowhere. So this last example, I think, is more about why the source rules don't work than why the residence rules don't work. Yeah, did you have a question?
When was the timing? Because Ireland was in dire financial straits as a country. I mean, they bounced back.
In 2008 or? In 2008?
2006, 2008.
Yeah.
And then a number of companies have done this. American insurance companies have done it.
Yeah.
Actually, when Arthur Anderson was in trouble,
Yeah.
after You know, their problem,
Yeah.
they had a
Yeah.
affiliate there called Accenture, based
Yeah.
in Dublin. They're still in Dublin, and they put all their assets in Accenture, so I've seen
Yeah.
a lot of, that's,
Yeah.
now I'm understanding why companies are doing that.
I think the Irish have been pretty smart in many ways, but not in all ways. The Irish, they're in the EU, and so that gives them great flexibility. They decided to become a kind of a tax haven. Well, the Cayman Islands is a tax haven. It has a zero tax rate, and kind of nothing happens there economically, simply because it's a small island without that many people, without that much natural resources. So Cayman Islands is a pure tax shelter. Nothing happens there. No money is, I'm exaggerating, of course, very little, but profits end up there. Ireland is in a different type of situation. Ireland is a kind of a tax haven in which things do happen. Their tax rate is 12.5, it's not zero. There are people in Ireland, they speak English, which is a very useful language in the world economy to speak. They're right across the water from England, which is obviously a robust economy. So the Irish are kind of a tax haven that they they offer a low rate for genuine tax competition. I mean, in other words, for actual economic activity to be placed there, but then they throw in the other business as well of being a Cayman-style tax haven. So I think the Irish have done well for themselves. They've done poorly for other people. Basically because their tax competition, when you have something called tax competition, what it means is the parties are competing with each other. So one side does well, others do poorly. The United States and even countries like Germany, England, or the UK and France, they're kind of didn't really work for them to do exactly the same thing that Ireland did. So Ireland kind of undercut them a bit. What Ireland did badly was they got caught up in the banking scams of the early 2000s. So all of that, I think they're pretty smart. Where they were stupid was they let scam banking take over their economy, and then when it collapsed, they paid off the banks in full, and to the detriment of their own taxpayers. So I think they mismanaged that. But all this stuff, I think Ireland has been very smart, except for the fact that they may be in trouble, they may lose it now. But anyway, so you have neither residence nor source is working very well with companies. Well, I've sort of now again been showing mainly how source doesn't work. But what about residence? Well, the U.S., in theory, is going to tax someday all of Apple's profits. How can Apple earn profits abroad and not pay immediate U.S. tax? Well, again, you or I, if we earn money abroad as individuals, we're going to be taxed on it right away. But this is where the realization requirement comes back in. Again, I pointed out that we might intuitively be offended by the idea that why should I pay tax just because my stock went up or because my home is more valuable? Maybe next year will be less valuable. We have the realization requirement for individuals, and whether it's good or bad or whether we ought to rethink it, it's there, but it sort of makes intuitive sense, and it does track some reality, which is namely the fact that you don't have super direct access. That's true, you could sell your General Electric stock, but you don't have super direct access to what the company is doing, you don't really control it. But the very same principle applies to foreign subsidiaries of U.S. companies. So you have Apple US, and it owns Apple Ireland. It owns 100% of Apple Ireland. If they wish to, they could operate it as a branch. A branch would mean that there's no separate legal entity, they just put an office there. But instead they operate it as a separately owned subsidiary. So in the eyes of the law, in the eyes of the tax law, the fact that Apple owns 100% of Apple Ireland, owns 100% of its stock, they manage it, they take money in, they put money in and they take money out as they like, and no one will complain because they're the 100% owners. That is treated as being no different from you or I paying tax on General Electric stock. So under the realization requirement, the U.S. law would say, the mere fact that Apple Ireland stock has been more valuable, had profits, that doesn't mean Apple is currently taxable. Apple hasn't gotten the money yet. Some separate legal person has gotten the money. So Apple will, in general, only be taxed when it sells Apple Ireland, which is not happening anytime soon, or when it takes profits out of Apple Ireland. So, by the way, it's been called a headache for Tim Cook. Apple now has $200 billion abroad, foreign profits. When I say it's abroad, some of it is actually in U.S. banks denominated in U.S. dollars. But what I mean by it's abroad is it belongs to Apple's wholly owned subsidiaries. This can, to some extent, affect Apple's ability to use the money. For example, suppose Apple wanted to use this money that's from Apple Ireland is actually in, quote, in the Cayman Islands. In the Cayman Islands simply means it's owned by a Cayman's entity. Maybe some of it is in Cayman's banks, but it doesn't have to be. What if Apple wants to pay dividends to its shareholders? Well, if they use this money to pay dividends to their shareholders, either they have to dividend it back to themselves first, or even if they went directly to their shareholders via this money, the IRS would say that you've brought that money home, you've paid tax on it. So Apple, when they're going to pay dividends, or maybe it was Microsoft, I forget, despite having all this money in the bank, they actually borrowed from a bank. Luckily for them at very low interest rates, since the bank knew it was like essentially a zero risk loan. So they have this money that they, quote, can't access. Again, that's an exaggeration. Any use they want to make with the money, then they have to talk to their lawyers and accountants and figure out, can we do what we want to with this money without it being treated as a taxable repatriation to the US? And then maybe someone will come up with something clever. They either can or they can't. Fundamentally, this money that Apple, and by the way, most companies have their accountants stipulate that this money is permanently reinvested abroad. It'll never, ever, ever come home. They get accounting benefits from doing that I won't go into today. But so Apple has $200 billion, quote, abroad. And again, all that abroad really means is that it could be awkward or inconvenient for the company to use the money however it likes without paying the tax. What will they pay when it comes home? Answer, $70 billion, 35% rate. You get a credit for foreign taxes paid, but they're not paying foreign taxes on this money. So there'll be no foreign tax credits, again, overstating a little bit. So Apple is like looking at this money, and they've said, or at least privately, we're never bringing this money home, again, in the sense that the US tax authorities will never. Well, actually, I think what they're hoping, and they have pretty good reason to be hopeful on this, is that someday the Congress will give them an ability to access the, like, a few years ago, Congress passed a dividend tax holiday. They said if you bring the money home in the next year, we'll only tax you at like 1/20th of the rate we had otherwise. Or maybe Congress will decide not to tax foreign source income anymore, and the old stuff will get away. So what they're really waiting for, to some extent, is for Congress to blink and to say you can get at the money, or finding some other way. So this money is, quote, trapped abroad. What if Apple wants to invest more in the US? They can't get their hands on this money. Not true. That's not really the point. The point is that it is inconvenient. It is costing Apple money, and this is money that is wasted. It's not because they have to run through hoops and they can't just do what they like with their money. They have to play games to do what they like with lawyers. They may have to invest some of the money in suboptimal things. It's probably costing them money. They're making less profitable use of this money. For an example would be, we could have just brought our own money home, but instead we're going to borrow from a bank, and it's going to charge us an interest rate because they don't understand our investment opportunities as well as we do, so they're afraid we're lying to them or hoping to stiff them if we go bankrupt. So that would be an example. So anyway, there are these profits that are trapped abroad. And again, trapped is a word of art. So this leads both to inversions and to the EU state aid case. So why don't I, by the way, anyone who has any questions or anything, please speak up. So, well, Apple has not inverted, but what did Burger King do? So I don't know Burger King, or why did Burger King do it? I don't know Burger King's business very well. There's a very big case with Pfizer, a drug company, and they were going, I'll use Pfizer. Pfizer was going to make a deal with a company called Allergan, which is an EU, by the way, Allergan is a fake European company. It's really a US company. They managed to invert earlier. Allergan, so these are both drug companies. Drug companies, as an industry, pay very little tax. And the reason is what they have is intangible property. They have the value of their patents. How expensive is it to make high commercial value pills, whatever it is, whether it's some prescription drug or it's things for impotence or whatever it is. How expensive is it to make a pill? The answer is it costs almost nothing. Where can you make the pill? The answer is you can kind of make it almost anywhere. The value lies in the intellectual property of creating the medical thing, and then of course getting a patent for it, so people can't copy it until the generic thing kicks in. So these guys play the same game as Apple. As it happens, they don't go through Ireland. I think they just go straight to Bermuda or the Cayman Islands or places like that. So they all have these offshore profits, these profits that they've managed to give away to their own subsidiaries so that they won't face U.S. tax. And Allergan, I think, was a U.S. company at one time, but then it became an Irish company or something like that. So Pfizer decides it wants to invert. It wants to get out of the U.S. tax net, and I'll explain more why in a moment. Let me just say one other thing. I was about to say, well, drug companies, they can do whatever they like, but companies that have stores, that have tangible, an actual store in a place, they don't have as much scope for game playing as these guys. And that's true to a degree, but then I was thinking of Starbucks. Come on, Starbucks, you go into a place and you buy, they grind coffee beans at some point, and they make you a latte or whatever it is you like. That's right there. The store is right there. Why isn't Starbucks taxed? I think Starbucks is taxed to a degree, but what's the value of Starbucks? A lot of it's from the Starbucks name. I don't think they have a special formula for coffee, but they have the Starbucks name, and I guarantee you that is owned by some affiliate of Starbucks in a tax haven, and Starbucks UK is paying through the nose to this other Starbucks affiliate, so that's why it doesn't have any profits. So even a business like that, you'd think that's sort of kind of bricks and mortar, a business like selling coffee, even that has an intangible element that means that you don't have to pay much tax on it. But guess who, by the way, can't do this? The pizza store in the corner. I used them earlier, but obviously the pizza store in the corner, well, they're probably not incorporated, but, well, Domino's. I suspect the pizza, that it's true, even with pizza, you could start there with the brand name and maybe the secret formula, or if they had special sauce. Nonetheless, those guys are taxed because they can't play these same games. You have a supermarket. The supermarkets aren't super profitable, but it's true there are a few things they can do, but they're probably going to be taxed. So it's companies that have intangible assets that can play this game and not pay any tax anywhere. And it's a combination of they play games under the rules that they're allowed to do, and part of it is that they can go, again, why did Ireland agree to give away 99.5% of the revenues? Because they would have gotten zero. All they needed was 5,000, said we'll put 5,000 or 10,000 people here, and Ireland was not the only place they could go. So they're very mobile. And again, that's the same with the drug companies. You can formulate these pills anywhere, well, not literally anywhere. You couldn't do it in North Korea, but you have a whole lot of choice of where to do it. By the way, I did once in a meeting with North Korean officials who wanted to know what do we have to do for companies to want to invest here from a tax standpoint? Because probably the first thing we need is the rule of law. But they're all these guys. They're all men. They're all look like they're between 50 and 60 years old, and they're all wearing these suits. And they all claimed not to speak English, but they did understand some, I could tell. Anyway, and they've probably all been shot by a machine gun since I saw them. Anyway, so you have a company, and it has a whole lot of profits abroad, and they're thinking, we don't like being a U.S. company, so we want to cease to be a U.S. company. And again, it's not really about the U.S. corporate tax rate. Well, it is in a way, because it's true that if the profits, quote, come home, they'll be taxed at the U.S. corporate tax rate. But it's not about operations in the U.S., because to some extent, operations in the U.S. are taxed. It's true that there's a whole lot of things companies can do to reduce their tax bill. But Apple, I haven't looked recently at their financial statements, but I think Apple can only do so much about selling iPhones to Americans, because the rules treat that, it's a very profitable sale, the rules treat that as a U.S. profit, and again, even if Apple Ireland owned the intellectual property, it would still be treated as income that arises in the U.S. So if our tax rate is higher rather than lower, that may discourage investment and economic activity in the U.S. But that's not related to this stuff. That's simply related, well, it is related to some extent to the extent to which companies will try to shift profits out of the U.S., and certainly the amount they'll actually invest in the U.S., but it's somewhat of a separate track from what I'm talking about now. Yeah?
You mentioned the difficulty of doing this when your value is intangibles rather than intangibles.
Yes.
I've always taught in my strategic management class the wisdom of IBM getting out of the laptop and PC business, selling it off to Lenovo at a great price, as being just about them seeing how that industry was going downhill, which it certainly was. I'm now realizing, and I just checked, they did do an inversion, and I didn't realize they had.
Oh, yeah.
And I don't know what the time of that was, but I'm starting to wonder if selling off a business that was largely about tangibles and becoming more a consulting company than anything else was more about preparing them for the inversion.
I don't know what their motive was. To some extent, the tangible business, to the extent that it's profitable, it's still going to go on. If it's higher tax, that's going to reduce its appeal. And people will also try to come up with ways to repackage and relabel it as intangible business. But operating in the U.S., it's true that high versus low tax rate in the U.S. will have an effect, but it's not really about this. So anyway, let me say, so there are two reasons why you would want to, well, first of all, let's say what invert is. Well, I think I'll do it in this order. I'll first talk about old inversions and new inversions, and then I'll talk about why you would invert. So you have a U.S. parent, and like Apple or anyone else, and has all these foreign subs, wholly owned companies that are abroad. And they want to invert. What does that mean? Again, they're still going to have a U.S. company that's conducting U.S. operations. In the old days, what it meant was you don't want the U.S. company to own the foreign subs. So there was a wave of inversions. It was happening as early as the 80s and the early 90s, but it really took off after 2000. And oddly enough, 9/11 affected the politics of this. A company called Stanley Works, a machine manufacturer that had been in Connecticut since 1843, announced they were planning to invert, and it caused kind of hysteria. What a traitor company, an old Benedict Arnold company, all this stuff. I think 9/11 actually contributed to the atmospherics of that. They ended up backing off, and then a statute was passed. But anyway, so what Stanley Works was going to do was they were going to create a new entity, and basically all the shareholders in Stanley Works would become the shareholders in this Caymans company. I'll call it CAECO. And when the dust is settled, basically all the subs would go to CAECO, and so would Stanley Works, and all the Stanley Works shareholders become shareholders of this company. You basically just swap a share of Stanley Works stock for a stock of the same thing, except it's called a Caymans company. So this was the deal, and the main thing they were doing was now all these subsidiaries, their profits are never going to go to the U.S. They're going to go to the Caymans company instead of going to the U.S. company. So the U.S. will never tax all that money, past and future. Past, I mean stuff they'd already done, and future profits they expect in the future. But the thing about this transaction was that it was singularly, nothing really happened. It's just a bunch of paper shuffling. You have the very same owners, the very same businesses, nothing has changed. It's sort of a sham in a way. It's literally true that the U.S. Shareholders own stock of a new company now, but kind of nothing has changed on the ground. The fact that that was true made it very easy for the Congress to pass a law stopping it. It also had to do with the politics at the time, by the way, because the George W. Bush administration was in office, and they were kind of a little unhappy about this. So they and the Democrats kind of agreed to do something about it. In the moderate inversion wage, one issue has been that the Republicans in Congress will not cooperate with the Obama administration, and not to get into that whole fight, but so the political environment is different today. So nothing could be done about it these days through Congress, at least so far. If there were a Republican president, ignoring the particular candidate they have now, it's possible with a Republican president that it would be addressed. We don't know. Because it would have to happen first, then we'd find out. So a law was passed that sort of said, if you do this, we're not going to respect the transaction. We're going to stay it's still a U.S. company. And do this was, of course, defined a little more precisely than I have in terms of the same owners before and after, the same business before and after. Nothing has kind of changed but the shares of paper about ownership. So those transactions no longer worked. You could do this if you liked, but it wouldn't be tax effective. The U.S. law would say, guess what? This is still a U.S. company, even though it was incorporated in the Cayman Islands. So that put an end to that. But the new inversions have come up. So the new inversions differ from the old inversions, and the reason why the law doesn't automatically block them is because they are real transactions. So here again, although this did not end up happening, Pfizer and Allergan. Pfizer is here, and Allergan is there. And they have an actual merger. By the way, Pfizer was so overpaying for Allergan that apparently when the deal fell apart, Pfizer's stock price went up, I think. And that was not because it was inherently a bad idea, but because they were kind of overpaying Allergan. They just made really a bad business deal. Anyway, Pfizer and Allergan has its subs, I suppose. They merge, but they make Allergan the new parent. So that seemingly doesn't solve the problem. Now, so far I've talked about the repatriation problem, the profits that are taxed here. In theory, up the corporate chain, the profits still go back to Pfizer because those subs are still subs of Pfizer, and the reason they are is because it would have triggered a humongous tax bill to change that. Well, first I'll say, why does this deal, quote, work? It's not a sham deal. These are both real companies. Allergan is large compared to, I don't know if it's as large as Pfizer, but at least it's non-trivial compared to Pfizer. So if you ask afterwards, is the new company, has the ownership changed? Yes, suppose they're equal size. Pfizer people used to own 100, Pfizer shareholders used to own 100%, they now only own, say, 50%. Ownership has changed. Is the company in doing new businesses? Yes, they're doing Allergan's businesses plus their own. So this is not a sham transaction. It may be a highly tax-motivated transaction. Oh, and they claimed that there are all kinds of synergies from bringing these two drug companies together. Who knows if that was true or not? But it's not a sham transaction. It's a real business merger between two companies. If this had happened, it would have had genuine impact of some kind. Certainly on the shareholders who now own a slightly different, they now own half of a bigger pie instead of all of a smaller pie. Anyway, so what was the deal here? Well, the first deal, I've told you the first reason that companies want to, quote, invert is get out of being a U.S. company is because they want to get this money from these, they want to be able to get their mitts on this money from the subsidiaries. And again, if you simply pay a dividend, it's still not going to work. Pfizer still owns these subs, and it's still going to be taxable in the U.S. But once you have a separate parent somewhere else, again, Allergan owns Pfizer, which means, of course, the Pfizer and the Allergan shareholders together own Allergan, which owns Pfizer, so it doesn't really mean anything that Allergan owns, economically, that Allergan owns Pfizer rather than the other way around. It's just a corporate law thing. But anyway, now Allergan, as the parent on top, can make deals with these subs. It can say, for example, how would you like to buy some of our stock? And what do you think the subs say? They say yes, since they're wholly owned by Allergan. If Pfizer had done that, if you buy stock in your corporate parent, that would be treated as bringing the money back to the U.S. But now, the U.S. will have tunnel vision as a matter of its corporate law and tax law. We don't see anything above Pfizer. Pfizer is a U.S. company. We don't look up at Pfizer's shareholders. So if Pfizer's owner, Allergan, is getting money from these guys, it's sort of not a tax event. So you can actually get the money home to the top of the chain simply by skipping Pfizer, by going straight to Allergan. And then once you've done that, you can do what you like with the money without facing U.S. tax consequences. So that was one reason for doing it, was it enabled these companies. And again, when accountants claimed that a particular company's earnings were permanently reinvested abroad, would never ever come home, it's estimated that the amount of earnings so designated would exceed $2 trillion. So it's a lot of money. Anyway, so the reason Pfizer wanted to invert and not be a U.S. company anymore, a U.S. at top, again, Pfizer would still be literally a U.S. company, would be owned, but the head of the group would be a non-U.S. company. The one reason they wanted to do that was they figured all these earnings that Pfizer as a drug company had put into places like Puerto Rico, well, not Puerto Rico, but wherever it was. I think some Caribbean countries are often where they do where they make pills. Instead, they can now get, the group as a whole can now get the money without paying U.S. tax. The other reason was as follows. I pointed out that insofar as Pfizer or Apple or anyone else is actually in business in the U.S., they're going to have U.S. profits and they're going to pay some U.S. tax, but they can try to do their best job possible. How am I doing in time, by the way?
Oh, you're fine.
Yeah, okay. They're going to do the best job possible of having as little taxable income as possible. So one thing they're going to try to do is, in this scenario, guess who borrows money? Is it Pfizer or is it the subs? Answer, it's Pfizer, because you'd rather have the interest deductions in the U.S. The banks would probably be happy to lend to the subs. Pfizer might have to guarantee it and say, if our sub runs out of money, we'll pay it, but the banks wouldn't mind lending to the subs. So that's one thing. So you load up all the debt in the U.S., so you get interest deductions in the U.S. and you reduce U.S. taxable income. There's no reason to reduce Cayman's taxable income. It's already zero. Well, the Cayman tax is already zero. But what's even better is you can do intra-company loans. So here's what companies that face the headache of being active, making money in a jurisdiction with a high tax or the positive tax rate. Here's one thing that companies would like to do, and believe me, it's not rocket science. They would like to have the sub lend money to the parent, and then the parent can pay interest deductions. Well, where did the sub get the money from? Guess what? The parent gave it the money 5 minutes before that. So here's a simple thing you would do. You give money to your sub for equity. You buy stock of the sub. The sub then lends the money back to you, and now you pay interest deductions. And the result is that you have U.S. interest deductions, and you're reducing U.S. taxable income. But the Cayman Islands doesn't have an income tax system, so they're not taxing it. If you did this between the U.S. and Germany, you're not really getting anywhere. Germany is going to tax it. But if you do it with the Cayman Islands, so you're reducing the U.S. tax base. But the U.S. rules won't allow you to benefit from doing that. The U.S. rules say, I'll call them CFC rules, the risk of more jargon. CFC is Controlled Foreign Corporation. Those are your foreign subsidiaries. The U.S. rules say, and actually many other countries have similar rules, it's not just the U.S. They say that if your subsidiaries earn interest income, it doesn't depend upon the fact that it's from another group member. If your subsidiaries just have money in the bank, we're going to tax that today. We're going to treat that as income of the parent because it's just too easy to put that income wherever you want. Even if we want to defer taxing income on real business operations abroad, we don't exempt that. So the U.S. has a rule that says that if your subsidiaries earn interest income, among other things, it'll be taxed immediately in the U.S., in effect as a dividend to the parent. So that completely destroys the whole point. You reduce U.S. taxable income by getting interest deductions, but then the interest income of the sub comes back and it's taxed you after all. That's completely pointless, so you wouldn't do that. It doesn't help you. But what happens once Pfizer has a deal with Allergan? Well, then the company can do things such as the following. Allergan has siblings of Pfizer. These are not subs of Pfizer. They're kind of so now you can maybe have Pfizer through Allergan. Maybe Allergan puts money in these guys and they lend it to Pfizer, and Pfizer pays interest back. Now you are getting interest deductions that are stripped out of the U.S. tax base, but the CFC rules don't work anymore because these have no American connection. They're subsidiaries, foreign subsidiaries of a foreign company. So I think for Burger King, I don't know that much about them, but with Burger King and Tim Hortons, I think this was a big factor. Burger King, obviously, although there's some intellectual property, they're the name and all that stuff. Burger King is actually selling hamburgers in the U.S., and that's bearing some tax. So I think it was valuable to Burger King to be able to use Tim Hortons, have Tim Hortons on top, and therefore find it easier to strip profits out of the U.S. tax base. So you get these two main reasons for inversion. So I really went deep in the weeds. I could come up with a couple of smaller reasons. But one reason is you've built up all these foreign profits abroad. Some of it is from genuinely having operations abroad, but a lot of it is just from you doing tax planning to put income in tax havens abroad. Now it's awkward to access the money and use it as you like without paying tax to the U.S., which you don't want to do because it seems so avoidable. It seems like someday it's going to go away. Now you invert, you get a foreign parent. Unfortunately today, from the company standpoint, it requires a real business deal, so you have to think about, is that a business deal we really want to do? And if we don't like the business deal, do we dislike it enough to outweigh the tax benefits? So one reason is It's going to make it easier for us to get our hands on our foreign profits that we put into tax havens. And the other reason is it's going to make it easier for our lawyers to figure out ways for us to reduce our U.S. taxable income and our U.S. operations. By the way, another reason why I say this is all tax haven income is, again, if a U.S. company is reporting taxable income in Germany, they're paying a lot of tax already, and we have something called the foreign tax credit. We credit against our tax what you've already paid in the foreign country. So if a U.S. company operates in Germany and pays tax there and then brings the profits home, it's not going to pay much more tax because it already paid plenty to the Germans. So you have, so this is sort of what tax inversions are all about, is there ways of getting your hands on the foreign profits, which might have been U.S. profits. By the way, when I say, in the case of Apple, I kind of think, from an economist standpoint, to the extent that you can say what the source of income means, it's not clear how coherent an economic concept it is, but to the extent you can say anything that means anything, Apple surely did earn its money in the U.S. because it really came from those smart engineers who were undercompensated because they had stock options that they would earn wearing their shareholder hat. In many other cases, it may be unclear. There may be a U.S. company that actually, again, the source of income is not an easy concept to figure out what it's supposed to mean. There could be a U.S. company that actually makes profits and a lot of money in Germany, depending on how we define that. I mean, that in truth, quote, made a lot of money in Germany. And so the U.S. companies are not only avoiding U.S. tax, and all the other companies, not just the U.S. companies, they're also, but you kind of have to be multinational or you don't have these opportunities. Likewise, the EU companies are playing games and are avoiding tax. But as it happens, Germany is not going to cut as favorable a deal with you as Ireland is because they're in a different situation. They just face they're a much bigger country. Yeah.
Dan, do you think it's effectively hopeless to collect corporate taxes from businesses? Because, I mean, they go through all of these different ways of trying to avoid them. I mean, is it a lost cause to even bother?
That's a good question. I think it's a couple of things I'd say is, one is that it's because there's this money that's already out there reflecting past decisions, it's worth shoring up for now. A second is, it goes back to whether we have, to the fact that we have an income tax with a realization rule. It's very hard to give up on the corporate income tax when you have an individual income tax, and so that could be rethought. So actually, I'll talk about that for a moment. So I like Apple. I like their products. By the way, I'm sort of, on the one hand, I'm kind of, it's part of me is irate about the tax planning they've done, but I also know that it all perfectly legal and worked under the law, and I also know that they kind of, the executives would be cheating the shareholders in a way if they didn't do it. I'm certainly not well, you can see what I have in my pocket. I'm not going to boycott Apple, etc. But I'm sorry, where was I here? But I'm trying to think what was my transition. But but why is it offensive to me to some extent to have Apple do this? Well, it's actually economically inefficient. Apple is a very good company, but if what they do is tax at zero, and what some other type of company does is taxed at a higher rate, that's inefficient. It creates shifts between things. But here's another problem. In all due respect to the late Steve Jobs, but I think Steve Jobs became a multi-billionaire. Ability to pay taxation, Steve Jobs is wealthier than any of us. I think Steve Jobs should have paid significant tax. But what did Steve Jobs do? I'm not fully familiar with his tax return. He got the famous $1 a year salary. He's paid $1 a year. Poor guy, how could he cheat himself like that? Well, no, he owned a lot of shares of Apple. So as a result, if Apple is taxed, he is taxed. By the way, let me just give you another piece of this. Suppose Apple is actually paying 35% tax in the US, or on its worldwide profits and everything Steve Jobs helped them to do. It used to be that the top individual tax rate was only 35%. It recently went up to 39.6, but still, let's say 35. So what happens if we change the law so that Apple was deemed to be paying Steve Jobs $1 billion a year salary? Well, that's too high, but a $200 million a year salary. If Apple's being taxed, it sort of doesn't matter. They deduct $200 million and they save $70 million of taxes. Steve Jobs gets $200 million and he pays $70 million of taxes. By the way, they could adjust the amount. So it sort of makes no difference than if you made the thing tax-free and didn't allow it to be deducted. if it were tax-free but non-deductible, they would change the nominal amount so that he'd end up with 140 and they'd be at 140. But so as long as Apple is taxed, it sort of doesn't matter that Steve Jobs is being paid only $1 a year and is making all his money through profits. But if Apple isn't being taxed, then he's never being taxed under the income tax. There's one last rule. I mentioned that you're not taxed on appreciated property, stock that went up in value until you sell it. If you die holding it, then your heirs never have to pay tax. They kind of get tax-free to the value increase to a value of death tax-free. So no one will ever pay tax on the appreciation of Steve Jobs' shares. That means that Steve Jobs sort of escaped the tax system completely, with one exception, the estate tax. That's a different, that is actually, people do very well planning out of that, but he was probably so rich that I imagine he must have gotten hit. I don't know what happened to him under the estate tax. We could have a debate about whether we should have the estate tax or not. But it's sort of a different proposition. So what's sort of what's offensive to me in a way, apart from the inefficiency of it, is that, again, I have nothing against Steve Jobs. I don't think he was that pleasant to work for, but he kind of made the products great and actually improved a lot of people's lives. Well, obviously the shareholders and the employees who got rich, but also we like using these devices and so forth. So that's great. I don't want to punish success, but people who do very well should pay a share of tax, I'd say, commensurate with that. And in the case of Steve Jobs, that means you've got to have the Apple corporate tax working well, or it doesn't happen. So that's why that's an example of why, again, without Apple, it's not a matter of people being evil. Apple is kind of doing what they have the incentives to do. But it leads to results that I don't like, at least. Well, how could you, yes.
You know, it is disturbing because Apple recently reported $55 billion of profit.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, in your discussion, how much of that was funneled away from U.S. tax?
But that's an accounting, so.
That was the accounting income.
Yeah.
$55 billion.
They paid
More than like Facebook, Microsoft, and
Yeah.
Google,
Yeah.
and some other companies.
Yeah, that was.
That was a
Well, here's the thing, yeah. So there's, actually, it's very hard to know. Apple is required to and does publicly report, have an earnings statement for shareholders' benefit and for investors' benefit. But that statement doesn't really say how much tax they paid. Apple used to pretend to be paying a lot more tax than they really were. And again, when I say pretend, it's not a matter of fraud. These foreign taxes that they're going to, in theory, pay someday, but probably not, most companies would tell their accountants we're never repatriating the money, and then the reason was that the accountants wouldn't score the taxes as an expense on the income statement. Apple, for some reason, didn't do that for many years. I think, one, they figured, we're so good, we don't need to have our reported earnings look higher. People know how good we are. And the second thing was they want to be able to tell the U.S. Congress we're good citizens, we're paying tax. So we don't really know how much tax Apple pays. There are some accounting experts, some of them are like in business schools or other departments of universities who are trying to figure it out, and they use very sophisticated methods, but not directly reported. So Apple probably didn't pay much, but even their accounting statement of how much they paid might not really be true as an economic matter. And whether it was true or not would depend upon, you'd have to start making projections about the future. Like, they haven't paid it this year, but is it realistic to think they'll have, so it's a very hard question. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're just about out of time, so I just
Yeah.
wanted to see if anyone else had any questions for Dan.
Well, you lucked out. I was going to tell you the used cases too.
Well, thank you, Dan. That was
Yeah.
fascinating.